we would like to welcome everyone here for this family reunion. But first of all, I've got to figure out which family it is. I know some people say that this is the Wilhelm family reunion, and other folks would say, including my father if he were here, that this is the Wilhelm family reunion. So whatever you prefer to call this family, welcome. We're glad you're here. My name's Larry Norman. My father was James Ellis Norman. His mother was Bessie Emmeline Wilhelm Norman, and her father was James Benton Wilhelm, and his father was Martin Wilhelm, and I won't go any further back than that. The lady standing next to me is my sister, Mary Susan Craver Norman, who is the Norman Craver. I've always made that mistake. But anyway. And her father was James, well, her folks are the same as my folks because that's my sister. So I'm not going to repeat all that. Yeah, we hope. That's right. I caught that. We are here to celebrate our family, particularly the family of Martin and Elizabeth Wilhelm, to share history, to share stories, to meet new relatives, to see some that we might not have seen for a long period of time, and to enjoy Christian fellowship and a great meal. We want to thank New Home Church for allowing us to be here today, and for James Benton Wilhelm family who was active in this church. I understand the land for this church was actually given by the Matthews family, but the Matthews that gave the land had married a Wilhelm who had great influence on him. Anyhow, but we want to thank them. The restrooms, I've been told, are located in the back of the building. We hope to share family information and to recognize each family that's represented here, all of the children of Martin Wilhelm. And we would like, at the appropriate time, for someone from each family to stand and tell what you know about your ancestor and your particular family. As I said, my sister is standing next to me. She's my much older sister. And I always do what my older sister says, so that's why I'm standing here at this point. I also want to, and I will repeat this maybe a little later on, I want to thank Susan and Luann and Jim Wilhelm. I want to thank all of them and the others who have helped put this on. I think this is a wonderful event to have, and I hope you have a great time. Susan's now going to tell you a little bit about, I think, genealogy.
Right. Genealogy is a fascinating study of family trees, but it's not an exact study because of record keeping in past times. Names were spelled many different ways. First names and middle names were often inverted, and names in a family were used over and over, so you weren't sure exactly which person you were talking about. Also, the dates often vary for a person's birth and death. Family Bibles were used to record births and deaths, but they were often recorded so long after the event that some of those dates were not accurate. Tombstone dates are not even completely reliable for the same reasons. And when census records were taken, it seems that a prerequisite for being a census taker was that you were deaf, dumb, and blind. Because the older census records are just full of all kinds of mistakes. So this brings us down to one more documentation for dates, and that would be a death certificate, which only came into use in the latter 1800s, and they seem to be the most accurate for dates, but not particularly for spellings of names. In doing this research, Luann and I have done our very best with spelling and dates, but you will probably see some mistakes in your family tree, if you see some printed material we have here today of your ancestors. For example, our ancestor James Benton Wilhelm is buried right out the door here in the cemetery, and we have reason to believe that his birth date and his death date on that tombstone are incorrect. So you can't always depend on a tombstone. When Luann and I started working on this project, we were fortunate to be able to find all these people who have been working on this for years. You know, before the internet, research was done by family Bibles, the library, documents in courthouses, interviewing people, following paper trails, and just searching cemeteries. Well, when Ancestry.com came along, it opened up a whole new world for us as far as people being able to read and share their information online. And we owe so much thanks to so many of these people who came before us. Some of those people are the late Nell Dinkins, who researched for many years, Janice Moreland, a lady who lives in Iowa that knows more about Yadkin County than we know, and she never lived here. Pat Wilhelm, and Pat, you need to raise your hand over there. Pat Wilhelm, my brother Larry, David Martin, raise your hand, David. Steve Binkley, who I don't believe is here with us today. Ann Phillips, raise your hand, Ann. Ann Scott, raise your hand there, good. Candace Dinkins, and I don't think she's here today with us either. But there are many, many more people out there whose names appear online. Probably the most famous person that we have come across in our research was the late Senator Sam Ervin of Watergate fame, if those of you who remember that. And his wife was a descendant of George Wilhelm Jr., brother to Martin. And Senator Sam also did a lot of genealogy work on our family. Okay, Pat and Bill Wilhelm are here today. And Bill, raise your hand over there. Okay. Bill is a descendant of Aaron Wilhelm, who was a younger brother to Martin. And Pat has done extensive research on the family and comes today with her maps, which you'll see across the back of the room back there. And she's going to answer questions for you later, which she will always know the answers, trust me. We're also grateful to Peggy McBride, who could not be with us, who shared with us the James Benton Wilhelm family Bible that was completely full of old tin-type pictures, and that gave us a starting place for finding the pictures of Martin and Elizabeth, and Ann's going to tell y'all a little bit more about that later. My cohort in this is Luann Dinkins, and I want y'all to know that Luann Dinkins has searched this county from top to bottom. She's been to the library, to the courthouse, to the cemetery. She's gone up and knocked on strangers' doors and said, "Are you related to me?" She has made hundreds of phone calls. She's researched maps. She has begged and begged for photos, and she has put together a very thick book about this family and much more. So she knows everybody and everything. So ask her some questions. Okay, is Andrew Mackey here today by any chance? Andrew, great. Andrew Mackey is with us today, and I didn't get to see you coming in, but he is here. He is a Yadkin County historian, and we're so glad you can be with us today.
All right, I'm going to tell you a little bit about John George and Wilhelm, and I can't take any credit for this material, but John George Wilhelm, our known history begins about 1740 in Bavaria, Germany, with the birth of John George Wilhelm. We have no record of his parents. At the age of 24, he boarded the ship Hero in Rotterdam, Holland. After making a brief stop in Cowes, England to board more passengers, the ship set sail for America. John George arrived on American soil in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania on Saturday, October 27, 1764. Not long after arriving, he married 19-year-old Eve Kuntz. She was possibly born in Wilsbach, Germany. At this time in history, many German immigrants were coming to America to escape war, religious persecution, and living conditions in Germany. By the time John George arrived, the affordable land in Pennsylvania was inhabited. He joined other German immigrants and moved south to what became North Carolina, where fertile land was cheaper and available near creeks and rivers. In 1765, he bought 285 acres in Mecklenburg County to begin farming. Later, he would acquire more land in what was to become Cabarrus County. Pat Wilhelm, as mentioned earlier, has furnished us with these maps about this land that she will talk about later. John George and Eve began farming and rearing children. Their first child was born in 1765, and their 13th child was born in 1795, when Eve was 50 years old and George was about 55. Boy, I get good genes from two sides. Wow. This family was a religious family. The Lutheran and Reformed German families banded together to provide instruction in the Christian faith as well as in academics. The old Wilhelm farm site is now thought to be the location of the Oregon Lutheran Church near Salisbury. Church records of St. John's Lutheran Church near Concord show baptismal records for some of the Wilhelm children and grandchildren. John George was a farmer during the American Revolution. We have records that he supported the war effort monetarily. Records show the delivery to the treasurers of £7, 10 shillings for certificates. These certificates were exchanged in 1789 with an interest of £3, 3 shillings. John George died in 1796, leaving his wife Eve and 13 children. His will was probated in 1797, and a copy is in the State Archives in Raleigh. Pat Wilhelm has furnished a copy of this document. I encourage you to look at that. Eve died in 1815.
John and Eve had a son named George, and it is easier to refer to him as George Sr. to distinguish him from his son George Jr., which we'll talk about a little bit later. He was the sixth of their 13 children. He was baptized on May 5th, 1781 at St. John's Lutheran Church, Buffalo Creek, Salisbury. And at the age of 16, he married Catherine Schaffner, who was 18. We know very little about Catherine. Some sources say she was born in Holland, a census list England, but the name Schaffner is German. George and Catherine reared 10 children and were farmers. George died in 1843 at the age of 62, and court records in Davidson County show settlement of his estate. We do not know the date of Catherine's death or their grave sites.
Wilhelm and Elizabeth Jones Priam.
No, we think it's been.
Okay. Today we're here to honor Martin, the seventh child of George and Catherine Wilhelm. Martin was born in 1815, and at the age of 25 in 1840, he married Elizabeth Jones Priam, age 18, and the daughter of Enid and Mary Polly Priam. They were married in Davidson County, and they farmed there. By early in 1850, Julia, William, and Solomon had been born, and the family moved to Yadkin County. Elizabeth's family were living in Yadkin County, and they possibly moved onto Priam property. Logging was a possible reason for the relocation. By 1858, the family was complete with the births of Jane, James, Sally, and Ezekiel. In 1857, William died at the age of 13 from either diphtheria or tuberculosis. Martin farmed for a livelihood. Elizabeth was a midwife and was noted for the medicine she knew how to make from plants and herbs. Elizabeth was also a professional tailor and seamstress and had one of the first, if not the first, sewing machines in the area. Van Gogh owns that sewing machine, and it's on display right over here in the little alcove. So that actually belonged to her. Martin obviously was close to his brothers and sisters. When his brother George Jr. died, he was special administrator for his estate and was permitted to sell 2 horses and 1 cow. I would have hated to represent him in that estate. But anyhow, Martin was also close to his youngest brother Aaron. Aaron was the bondsman when Martin and Elizabeth were married. Aaron named 2 of his sons for Martin, James Martin Wilhelm and Benton Morrison Wilhelm. Aaron was a stagecoach driver to Camden, South Carolina. In addition to farming and logging, there was a strong history of work in transportation and carpentry among the Wilhelm men. When the War of Northern Aggression broke out, Martin did not go to fight, but he hired Freeburn G. Logan to substitute for him. Freeburn was married to Elizabeth Wilhelm, probably a cousin of Martin's. Freeburn served for over a year and was discharged because of chronic rheumatism, general debility, and the effects of old age, being 56 years old. Freeburn had a son by his second marriage named Martin Lee Logan. Martin lived to age 84, and Elizabeth lived to age 64. Both are buried in the Wilhelm Prim Cemetery in East Bend. And I have a note here that says we don't know the exact location of the home place of Martin Wilhelm. Also, be sure to look at the photographs over here of the tombstones that have been rejuvenated and cleaned and so forth over here on the left. I think you'll hear a little more about that. Actually, it's Martin and Elizabeth's tombstones.
You have on your tables a sheet like this that just shows you a list of who we're going to be talking about this afternoon. We're right now going to be starting with Martin and Elizabeth's number 1 child, Julia Ann Wilhelm Hutchins. And this is when we will be calling on different family members from different groups to stand and talk. I don't believe there's anyone here today from the Julia Ann Wilhelm Hutchins, but if I'm wrong, raise your hand. Okay. Julia Ann Wilhelm was the first child born to Martin and Elizabeth. She was born in Davidson County in 1841, and in 1861 she married William Vestal Hutchins, who had roots in Yadkin County but had lived in Indiana with his parents. Julia said goodbye to her parents and family and started west in a covered wagon. She was never to return to North Carolina again. The couple stopped over in Indiana and stayed for 3 years, having 3 children there, before packing up one more time and moving to Hardin County, Iowa. In Iowa, Julia gave birth to 7 more children. 3 of those children died, 2 as infants and 1 at the age of 5. And then in the early 1880s, the family packed up again and moved to Elmira, Lane County, Oregon, where they were to remain. William Vestal's parents joined them there. Now, the following information that we have about Julia has been furnished to us by Ann Wilhelm Phillips, who is with us today, from a letter that she received in 2001 from Lois Carter, and it is about her great-great-grandmother, Julia. Julia was said to be a nice and kindly lady. She must have had a sense of humor, like many of the Wilhelms, as her occupation on the 1880 census is listed as keeping dirty house. In her later years, Julia suffered from arthritis so badly that she had to sit in a chair and scoot from the stove to the table to serve food. But when the chair legs wore down, she just got a new chair. Right before Julia's husband died, he was very ill in the bed for several days. And when he became so ill, suddenly the family could hear a clock ticking in the house. They checked. It was not their ordinary clock, and so they began searching for the source of the ticking to the point that they actually tore up the floorboards of the house. They never located the source of the ticking sound that stopped when William died. William died in 1901, and Julia 17 years later in 1918. Both are buried in Elmira, Oregon, and through lots of digging and lots of searching, we have been in contact with two of Julia's great-great-great-grandchildren, one in California and one in Washington.
William L. Wilhelm was born in 1843. He was the second of Martin and Elizabeth's children. He died at the age of 13 from either tuberculosis or diphtheria, and he was buried in the Wilhelm Prim Cemetery. Do we have anyone here from the next child, Solomon Philip Wilhelm? We do. An expert. And
Yes.
talk about him.
Let's see. My father was Henry Martin Wilhelm.
Stand up, Ann.
I'm Ann Wilhelm Scott. My father was Henry Martin Wilhelm Jr., his father being Henry Martin Wilhelm Sr., of which is the first child born to Solomon. This is all that's been told to me. I haven't documented a lot of this stuff through anything because birth certificates, of course, weren't done until the early 1900s. Death certificates weren't done until 1909, 1910, somewhere around there in North Carolina. The picture of Solomon over there, I have one at my house. I've tried to get a picture of or whatever. But Henry Martin Sr., being the oldest child of Solomon, his mother, Millicent Ann Norman, passed away in what I had been told was milk leg, of which we would probably say is phlebitis at this time in our life or whatever. She died as an infant. So that's when Solomon remarried Maria Letitia Spear and then had the rest of the children on that side. I don't know a whole lot about Solomon because my parents divorced. My daddy lived right across from me, spent school, and my parents divorced when I was a very young child, and my mother and I and my oldest brother moved to Georgia, which is where I currently reside. I know his child, Henry Martin Wilhelm Sr., was a very well-respected man in East Bend. Carpenter by trade. My mother says that he traveled all up and down building monasteries and stuff. I am the proud owner of his carpenter toolbox that is just the size of one of these tables and weighs a ton and has all kinds of old carpentry tools, this, that, and the other. How Henry Martin Sr. died, my oldest brother is 4 years older than me, right there on the beside my daddy's house, the lot there. Henry Martin Sr. was out there, and he told my brother to go get Little Neve, which was my grandmother, Geneva, and if anybody knew her, she was not little. But he called her Little Neve. He was 10 foot tall. She was vertically challenged. By the time she got out there, he'd already had a heart attack and passed away in the field. My brother was 5. This was March or April 1963. I was only 15 months old, so I have no personal recollection of him other than the people of East Bend and stuff, him being very active in the community and very kind and generous and all that kind of stuff, of which they produced just the one child. I've always been told they had the perfect love. There was 20 years difference in their age, and they dated 10 years and had one child, which was my father. And then he produced 2 children, and I'm the youngest, and my older brother, Marty. And then this is my grandson, Hunter. I have one child, and this is my 8-year-old grandchild. Hunter, right here on down the line. And we live right outside of Atlanta, Georgia.
Anybody else from that family that wants to speak? How about anybody from that? Oh, yeah, there you are. Go.
I'm not gonna talk.
Come on, Lisa.
I was
Melissa,
not
you need
prepared
to
to
talk.
Do this. Actually, and most of what I had learned actually came from Ann, and I had looked at some of this stuff recently. But Solomon's second wife, Letitia, there were several children born to them. My great-grandmother was the first, which was Mary Elizabeth Blakely. And then I know of Holmes Wilhelm, he was her brother.
Professor.
Beyond that, I
He
don't
was a
know anything
professor.
else. I mean, it's just,
There was William Garl. He never married. He was Holmes was the professor. There's
Wade.
There was Wade. He married, and all I knew was her name is Lil, and they never had any children. They actually came to my father's funeral. He died on December 10th, 1984. And then there's
Roy. Was there a Roy? Or was he?
yeah, I think so. I don't have.
That's
my-
the Dinkins family.
Right. I've got my laptop out there with my ancestry tree on there. And then right here is Melissa, she's Melissa Fletcher, Jane Wilhelm, Solomon's child, Jane Frances Wilhelm married a Fletcher, and this is, Melissa and I are on the same level of the hierarchy of the tree as Henry Martin's great-granddaughter, and then her being down that way. Off of Henry Martin's sister.
Okay. Everybody here from the Solomon family, just raise your hands so we know who you are. Okay, great. Okay.
Yes.
Before we move on to the next family member, for those of you here in the Norman family, we're double cousins with Ann because Millie Norman married Solomon, and she comes from that line, so we're double
Right, and
double cousins.
what I was told through the family tree or whatever, family history, is that when she gave birth to my grandfather, Henry Martin Sr., evidently it was milk leg. Of course, when women had babies, they went and laid in the bed for 2 and 3 weeks at a time or whatever, and it was, what I was told was milk leg. But again, my mother hearing that 60 years after she had passed. So there's no documentation. I haven't physically seen anything, but that's just what I've always been told.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, coming down our line, the next family member is Jane Frances Wilhelm, who became a Fletcher. And who do we have here from that family? Okay, you two and David Martin there. Okay, which one of you wants to talk first?
Jane was my great-grandmother who married Robert Martin Fletcher. And I have the family Bible on the Fletcher side that documents several births and deaths.
We want to see that.
Jane would be my second great-grandmother. Her daughter was Ada Fletcher. She married a Hall, and then my grandmother was there, and she was Valley Hall, and she married a Martin in Boonville. And then my dad was Clyde Martin, and then there's me. And then I've got grandchildren, so it's quite a long line. See, I show Jane as having married Davis Monroe Fletcher, and they had quite a few children. Pardon my glasses.
Stand up, please.
Okay, sorry. I'm young enough to stand. Davis Monroe was 1848. Davis was probably the biggest mystery, other than the two great-great-grandfathers that I've never been able to discover. My grandmothers both told me stories when I was young, and they would write down as much as they could remember, and I kept those. Found them about 15 years ago in a family Bible, pulled them out, and that was the start of my genealogy. I was trying to verify that information, and amazingly, both grandmothers had told stories and written names down from memory that had been passed down to them That was good for 200 years of history. It's pretty amazing. Davis was the mistake that my grandmother Martin had told of the story. And he was apparently had been passed down and was the reported son of a Robert Fletcher, but actually it was James Fletcher. Robert was actually his father, and I have not been able to figure out why the family wrote him out of the family history. Still don't know. I have a feeling that he may have remarried for a third or fourth time and abandoned the kids, but I don't know that for sure. I will give some of the names of the children. Hopefully there's people recognize these people. Davis Monroe's oldest son was James Monroe. He died shortly after birth. That was in 1870. William Thomas Fletcher was in 1871. He died in 1942. Ellen Ada Fletcher was my great-grandmother, and I do remember meeting her when I was a little boy, about 2 or 3 years old. Barely remember. I just remember walking into the house and being terrified. Because she was a rather old lady. Molly Beth Fletcher was next, 1875, and lived in 1957. I'm sorry, I did not bring all the information as to who they married. Esther Lillian Fletcher did marry a Hall. Pearl Dalton Fletcher, 1879, died in 1966. Robert Martin Fletcher, 1881, and died in 1974. Sue Anna Fletcher, 1883, and died in 1952. Roby Davis Fletcher, 1885, 1962. Della Frances Fletcher, 1888, died in 1972. And then their youngest was Rosa Lou Fletcher, 1891, and died in 1972. And I remember visiting her and her husband multiple times. Most of the family lived in this area, so I'm sure some of you knew them or have met them. If there's, I've got a lot more information at home. I did not bring it with me today. So if anyone wants more information, give me a name and a way to communicate with you, and I will be happy to share any info I have. I do not have a lot of information on my second great-grandmother, although my grandmother would talk about her fondly. Although her name was Jane, she referred to her as Joan for some reason. I don't know why. Thanks.
Hey, thank you. The picture just to the left of that second window there is a picture of that family, mother, father, and all of the children, and that is one of the few pictures that Luann and I were able to come up with that showed a complete family. So I would invite you to look at that. The only thing I would add to that, in reading her obituary, it stated that she was a loyal and consecrated member of the Primitive Baptist Church for 59 years. She was a kind and affectionate mother, a friend to all, and was known for her outstanding service and faithfulness. So, thank you.
The next child is James Benton Wilhelm, and I think we have several people from this family here. All of you who are here on the James Benton Wilhelm family, just raise your hand. Okay. I'm gonna give this information, and then I invite you to add to it or subtract from it. I'm reminded of a joke first, though. This is my great-grandfather. All of you probably remember Miss Clara Edwards on the Andy Griffith Show. Any of you used to watch the Andy Griffith Show? They said she was very proud of her family. She said that her father fought with General Pershing, her grandfather fought with General Lee, and her great-grandfather fought with General Washington. And Howard Sprague said her family couldn't get along with anybody. I don't know why that came to mind, but it did. James Benton Wilhelm was the son of Martin Wilhelm and Elizabeth Prim Wilhelm. He married Mary Emmeline Hutchins, daughter of John Rhodes Hutchins and Margaret Matilda Williams on February 12, 1874. And at that time, I understand that they were given a clock that I have a picture of here that is actually currently in my oldest son's possession. I understand this was a clock from her parents to them at the time of their wedding. But anyhow, the clock still runs great. They had 8 children. They settled in their home in the East Bend community. Mary died of a brain tumor at the age of 46. She left her husband, James Benton, to raise their children and 2 grandchildren, James Roy and Marla Wilhelm. James Benton was a well-known farmer. He also made charcoal. Charcoal was used by many of the local blacksmiths. Many of the Wilhelm children grew up to become teachers. James Ellis Norman, son of Bessie Wilhelm Norman, that's my father, once told a story about him and Carly Wilhelm making ice cream. I can hear him telling that story right now. I wish he was here to tell it himself. He said Aunt Carly took him out to the ice house carrying a bucket filled with cream and sugar. She also brought some salt. She dug out a hole in the ice big enough for the bucket, placed some salt around the ice, and she and James Ellis began to turn the bucket. They were making ice cream. This was his first taste of the good stuff, and he always remembered it. James Benton Wilhelm died on May the 28th, 1938. He and Mary Emmeline are buried in the cemetery right out here. Their children are Carly, Luther, Early, Bessie, all lived in Yadkin County. Alda moved to Bessemer City. Blanche moved to California. Nora moved west with her husband, Davis Martin, to the Redwood Forest. And there's a big picture over here of one of the trees out there. And Erie died at age 17. And of course, James Benton is buried out in this cemetery along with his wife. Now, add to, subtract from, folks that knew him better than I. Lou Ray, please tell us about him.
Can I come up there?
You sure can. I wish you would.
Do you remember him?
No, he was before me.
I guess I'm the only one that remembers on Grandpa Wilhelm. He was my great-grandpa, but we always called him Grandpa. My grandfather was the oldest child of James, and his name was Luther. And he married Florence Allen, and Luther taught school for a few years, and then he became Register of Deeds in Yankee County for 3 terms. And, excuse me, while he was on the 3rd term of the Register of Deeds in Yankee County, he got sick and died. He was only 35 years old. They had 2 little boys, my dad, Roy, and Marler. Dad was only 6 years old, and Marler was 4 years old. And she was the, I guess you call it telephone operator, like they had on television a long time ago, where you, Florence punched in those numbers. And even when my daddy was small, she would send him all over Gaggenville to take a message that she had gotten on the switchboard to tell so-and-so that so-and-so was sick and needed them to come, or whatever the message was. Daddy remembers, told me that he remembered doing that. My father, Roy, lived to be 100 years old, and he quoted his grandfather about like some people quote the Bible. He was always saying, now you plant the watermelons on the 1st day of May, and you better get the maters in if you want maters by July the 4th. And Grandpa said, and Grandpa cured tobacco this way, and it was real strange that he always talked about Grandpa. And the thing that amazed me was that in his 100 years, and I saw him every week almost, he never told me one unkind thing about his grandfather. I mean, he didn't say Grandpa spanked too hard, or Grandpa was stingy, or Grandpa made him work too hard, or whatever. And after his father Luther died, his mother Florence brought Marler and Roy back to East Bend and lived beside of Grandpa Wilhelm. And this picture over here is of me and James Benton and my older brother, who is now deceased. That cute little thing with the long stockings on is me. And I remember him quite well because he lived next door and I saw him quite often. And a lot of times Mom and Dad, when they were going farming or something, we'd have to go by his house and he'd say, well, let little Ray stay with me because she won't help much in the tobacco patch. And so I would stay with Grandpa. And I remember one science lesson that he gave me quite well. He said, now, he always liked us in his older age when I was very young. He said, now come over here and I'm going to tell you a secret, but I'm not going to tell it to anybody but you. Well, I was so excited about his secret. And he said, there's a robin building a nest in that little maple tree right there in the yard. And I was so excited because he explained all about what the robins do. They eat the bugs and the worms in your garden, and they lay eggs and they hatch. And he says, now every day when you come to see me, I'll hold you up and let you see that the robin is doing to the nest. And she put mud in it, and then she laid her eggs. And one day he didn't come out, and I kept wanting to see in the robin's nest, and I thought, he told me not to bother it, and I thought, well, it won't hurt if I kind of swing up on the limb and pull it down and reach over, look in, and I did. And about the time I was ready to grab the robin's nest, he came out of the door and he says, come here. Well, I didn't know what was going to happen. He told me not to bother it. And he says, I told you not to bother it, didn't I? And I said, yeah. Well, I got my pants dusted real well. He was always stern but fair, and I remember some of the stories one story that fascinated me was when he was courting Mary Emmeline, isn't that a pretty name? When he was courting, he said that he would go see her on his horse. He didn't have a car. And I don't guess he ever owned one, did he? I don't remember him ever owning a car. My daddy did later when he was growing up. But anyway, he went to see her on his horse, and coming home it was dark and cold, but the horse always knew the way home. He'd have a light. And he said that the horse got to acting crazy, wanting to run or jump and carry on, and so he said, well, I'll just let the old horse run. She wants to, and it's cold. So he let her open up, and she ran all the way home. And anyway, he put her in the stable, and he went on in the house and went to bed. The next morning, he gets up, he goes out to the barn, and there are bear tracks all around the barn, and big old claw marks on the door where the horse was. So he knew that there'd been a bear that night. And Marler is my grandmother remarried after a few years, and Marler went with her to live in Virginia. And Polly, Marler's daughter, is here. Polly, raise your hand back there. He had one daughter, Polly. And he went to Virginia, but somehow or another, the man she married had children, and his wife had died. And then they had a child, and so Marler didn't fit in very well and wasn't too happy with his stepfather. So he sold the only property he had, which was a gun, and bought a ticket back to Donnyhall. And he brought his clothes in a sack and walked from Donnyhall back to East Bend and lived with Grandpa. Grandpa raised him and my daddy. James Benton was who I call Grandpa. Luther was really my grandpa. This was my great-grandpa over here. And I always loved Aunt Carly because she was good to me as a kid. And when I was staying around or playing around, she would take me in the kitchen and open them big old biscuits, take some of that soft butter and mash it up with brown sugar and put it inside that biscuit. And when a hungry kid, that was good stuff. I guess that's about it.
Jim, talk about it.
Yeah, make him get up there.
I'll pass. Anybody else? For James Benton? What was his, Daddy used to talk about him coming down.
Jim.
He called him Jim.
Yeah.
And he would ride a big white horse down there, Daddy said. Anybody know the horse's name? Said he had a big white horse, and he used to say,
He
come
had a
on.
horse, but I don't know the
Said, come
name.
on, Jim, let's go for a ride. He'd
Now-
take him.
Now, my daddy's horse name was Dixie. He bought my daddy a horse to ride.
Yeah.
And Mama had 2 younger sisters, and they told it on Daddy that he used to ride by the girl's house, you know, and show
Right.
off and going fast.
Daddy also used to talk about going up there and helping cut ice in the pond.
Yeah.
And he would describe how they did all that with Grandpa
Well, back
Hill.
then, all the old places that I know of had an ice house.
An ice house. That's
And
what
they
he told
took the
me.
ice off of the river, put it in the ice house, and then you had ice during the summer.
Last year.
Put it underground.
That's right.
Covered it with sawdust.
Okay, we'll move on down to Sarah, Sally, Dalton, Wilhelm Binkley. Do we have anyone here from that family? We had hoped that Steve Binkley could be here with us today, and he had some family matter that came up, and he could not be here. But I'll give you sort of a rundown of what we know about her, and there's a whole lot out there. Steve has written a book about his family, and I would encourage you to find him on Ancestry, because he will let you read the book. It's quite interesting, but I'll give you just sort of a brief synopsis of her. Sarah was called Sally. She was the 6th child born to Martin and Elizabeth. She was born in 1854 in Yadkin County, and she lived her whole life in the county. She was a very beautiful woman, and she married a man named Columbus Hampton Binkley, called Hamp. They had one daughter, Emma, and 3 sons, Cicero, Gray, and Errol. Sally and Hamp lived in a big log house off Baltimore Road. The 18th census shows Emma as being a year old and another boy of age 19 living with them. Hamp and Sally made a lifelong practice of taking in boys who were having problems at home or who wanted to leave home and be on their own. Their son Gray was a carpenter as a young man, and he built a home for Hamp and Sally. Sally wanted her house to have a whole lot of windows. And when the house was completed and they moved in, Sally started making curtains for the windows. That prompted Hamp to say, "I'll never understand women. They tell you they want windows to see out of, and then the first thing they do is cover them up so they can't see out." Hamp never believed that radios picked up invisible signals through the air. He maintained that all the words and musics were just stored in some batteries. Sally did not like the woman that Errol chose to marry, so she told him that it would just kill her if he married this woman. Well, Errol married her anyway, and it did not kill Sally, but Sally held fast to her promise that she would never ever visit them in their house, and she never did. Sally was known to be a kind and generous woman. Daughter Emma had 9 children. Cicero did not have any children. Gray and Errol each had 1 child. Sally died in 1934 and Hamp in 1938, and they are both buried at Baltimore United Methodist Church. And Steve furnished us with some great pictures who are in this area of the room, and I invite you to look at them. One more.
Ezekiel, Zeal, Cicero, Wilhelm. I know we have some folks. Pat, who do we have here from that? Ann.
Ann and Eric.
Eric. Y'all
And-
talk
and
about
Dan.
him. And Dan. Talk about him.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, we always refer to it as EC. It's a lot easier than going through the big long name. He built mills. He was a carpenter, and he built several mills, including the one at Enid, and I think the one in East Bend also. And he married Sarah Smithman later in life. I think he was about 40-some when they married, and they had 2 children. Ernest Hubert Wilhelm, who was my father, and John Thomas. And John Thomas died at the age of, I think, 13. And sisters and brothers. Dan had 3 children, Gail, Charlotte, and Eric. And you can go from there.
Stand up. Okay, EC was the youngest, and after Martin Wilhelm died, the farm was divided up. There's a map, so I think it's over here somewhere, that shows which child of
Martin.
Yeah, Martin. Got too many names going through my head. Which child got which lot. And eventually, EC wound up buying out all of his brothers and sisters, except I think Solomon, who kept his lot. And it was around about 1910 when he married Sarah that I don't know if there was a house on the property or not, but he built a house or added to it. And they moved there after they got married, and my grandfather, Hubert, was born there in 1911. And then later, he sold the farm and moved to East Bend, I think when he built the mill up there in East Bend. And that house is the 2-story white house across from the school. It was already there, so they just bought it. And then it was around 1918 or 1919, they sold that house and moved to the end of Flint Hill Road at what is now Old 421. And there was a mill there that he ran, and had a store across the road from him beside the house that he ran also. And he died 1924, heart attack. And Sarah,
my grandmother getting killed at the mill.
And I guess Sarah still worked at the mill. The store was still open too, because my grandfather, I remember him talking about he would still handle the accounts, try to collect money and stuff from people who owed bills. And it was around December, was it 1934? Yeah. Sarah was working at the mill, and she had long hair, and it was down, and her hair got caught in the rollers and belts, and it flipped her around, and I think tore most of her hair off, and I think it broke both of her arms and some other serious injuries, and she died at City Hospital in Forsyth County maybe about 3 days later.
She was picking up corn cobs at back
Pops told that story. He told the story to me when I was a kid.
Yeah.
And she was picking up corn stalks to build fire.
Yeah, I've heard the same story.
Yeah. I know some of the older folks might hear it, but most of the younger ones probably didn't. And EC was a carpenter, and I think he built the mill here and did other carpentry work around the area, because I've heard some stories about that. Is there anything else?
My father said that EC was the best carpenter in Yankee County. He had a reputation as the best carpenter.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Do you know if EC traveled any at all? Because
Yeah.
see, my grandfather had the mill in East Bend because my daddy actually sold it, you know,
Yeah.
before he died or whatever.
Well, I think EC sold it probably to
Yeah,
Henry.
to Henry Martin.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but my mother, with her marrying my father and looking after my grandmother and grandfather in their elderly years or whatever, he said that he traveled, and it may have been with EC. That's why I'm asking, because he told about traveling up to Indiana, building monasteries
Yeah.
and all this kind of stuff, because mother helped him put new Celotex in the ceiling and all this, and they would take in like layers of paint and da-da-da-da-da, just
Yeah.
all kinds
Well-
of stuff, that he was a very talented man.
I know he did. The picture of Ezekiel there in the lower right-hand corner, Nell Dinkins gave it to me. We'd never seen one of them, and she brought it to me one day, and I was just tickled because I'd never seen it. But
Right.
we didn't know how old he was in that picture, and it doesn't show there, but there's a paper frame around it that had the photographer's name and Champaign, Illinois.
Got some pictures from Champaign. See, that's,
So-
he must have went with my grandfather.
Well, John R. Poindexter was up there too, and I know this because I have a deed of trust that EC borrowed from John Poindexter. It's like $100, and it was dated February 1898. So they were in Champaign, 1898, 1897.
Well, that's what he kept telling my mother, that, you know, she was, that he'd always ran up and down, traveling, building monasteries and things of that nature.
And
Being
then
a
I
partner.
have another one it's from 1903, and he was borrowing some money again from somebody here, and this was done in Oklahoma. So I you know, he got around, but I never knew what he was doing.
Great. Thank you for sharing that.
That's all I've got.
Okay, I think we've gone down the list of the siblings. Does anybody have anything else you want to add before we? Okay, yeah, that food back there is calling us. Okay, now we have to talk about some family business. The Wilhelm Reunion Cemetery is located in a field in a grove of trees just off of Baltimore Road out on Hennings Road. The plot is not real large, and we know from the stones there that Martin, Elizabeth, their son William, who died very early, Solomon, and Millie are buried there. Last week when I was there, Martin and Elizabeth's stones had been broken in two and were, laying over, and Solomon and Millie's stone was laying over. The only stone standing there was Williams. The area is covered in periwinkle and a few daylilies growing, and there are other stones and looks like pieces of monuments sticking up around. And because that cemetery is called the Wilhelm Reunion Cemetery, we think that there are other graves there, but we really don't know. And we're hoping that at some point we can go out and clean that area a little bit and see if any of those stones have any writing on them or anything. Well, this past week, Luann employed a man here in Yadkin County to go over to the cemetery and do repair work. And I saw those stones yesterday, and I was totally blown away with the remarkable work he has done. He has gone in and put set cement. He has put Martin stone up and has glued it back together. He has done the very same with Elizabeth. He has put Solomon and Millie stones back up, and William's stone was still standing on its own. They have been totally sandblasted, and they are a beautiful white now. It looks like an entirely different place, and we felt like that we needed to do this just to preserve this cemetery. And over on the end of this table are some pictures showing the before and after of what we have seen there. The repair company that went in initially had given us a great big figure to have this work done, and he came down considerably on that, and he is going to be sending Luann a bill for $400 for this work, and we think that it was worth it, and that he did considerable work there for us, and I know some of it he chose not to even charge us for. So on the back table back there is a money jar, and we strongly encourage, if you feel like you would want to contribute some money to this so that we can pay for this repair work. Does anybody have any questions about that? I know, Ann, you went to see it. Did you think it looked good?
I thought it looked great.
Okay.
Compared
Anybody?
to what his head looks like.
Right. Ann's got pictures of how it looked when it was completely overgrown and everything. Has anybody else seen it except me and Luann and so forth? But I encourage you, those of you who live in this area, to go and see it. If you don't know where it is, we can give you some directions.
Is that it?
Yep.
We want to thank again Susan and Luann for doing just a lot of work. We also want to thank you, Ray, very much for the use of this building, for paying for the use of this building, and we appreciate that very much. Thank you. And to Jim Wilhelm for furnishing the barbecue, slaw, beans, rolls, and banana pudding for our meal. Thank you, Jim. And to Alan Norman also for helping with the building. We appreciate all of that too. Most of all, we appreciate your folks coming. Family is so important. We want to use the time while we're eating and afterwards to get to know each other, write down some addresses. We need to stay in touch, because if this country's going to make it, we got to keep families strong. It's so important. At this point, I would like to ask Jim Wilhelm if he will lead us in blessing the food.
Let's pray. Eternal God, we are grateful. We know that you're God of the past. We know that you're God of the present. We know that you're God of the future. We thank you for forgiving us for our sins in the past. We thank you for the mercy you've shown us in the present. We thank you for the love and hope that you give us for the future. We thank you for this family, and we thank you for the many, many blessings that's been shown and given to us, and we understand that every blessing, everything we have comes from you, and we're thankful to that. We thank you for your love. We thank you for your grace and mercy, and we pray this afternoon that you would bless this food, that it may give health and nourishment to our bodies. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Okay. I think the best way to do the food is if you could come around this way and down behind this table to get plates, and go down the table that way over to desserts and drinks over there. So don't be shy.
Wait a minute.
Oh, wait a minute.
Hold on. I got to do one more thing. I'm
Oh.
sorry. I'm sorry. I'm very sorry. We have a new Wilhelm descendant. I can't go home unless I do this. But this is my son's baby that was born about 2 months ago. Little girl. Her name's Cheney, after my mother, who would love to have been here today. But I had to hold that up before I left. Y'all go eat.
Wait a minute. I've got another one right here. Okay, Shane, you got mine.
That's right.
Our family's growing.
Growing.
Okay, don't be shy. You folks over here, get up.